Good afternoon, everyone. We want to get started so that we have full time for this discussion. If you're a guest, welcome to Duke Divinity School. I know some of you are students, and we've been looking forward to this event for a long time. We are in the early stages of a several-day-long event that we've called Sounding the Passion, the climax of which will be the performance of James McMillan's newly composed St. Luke Passion. Its American premiere Sunday afternoon here in Duke Chapel, and I see some people in the audience who will be performing, singing in the Passion. So we're looking forward to hearing it done here in the chapel. This work is the culminating outcome of a discussion that's been going on now for 4 years that has involved representatives from the Divinity School here at Duke and representatives of the Faculty of Theology in Cambridge, as well as a few others. And so we wanted to take this time today to discuss the process of discussion, dialogue, reflection that has led up to James McMillan's composing of the St. Luke Passion, and fill you in on a bit of the background. So today's, the panel we're going to hear right now is to discuss that. If you can come back at 5 o'clock this afternoon in Goodson Chapel, James McMillan himself is going to give a keynote lecture about the work itself with a response by Sarah Coakley, Professor of Theology from Cambridge, who is arriving, we believe, this afternoon. She's not here yet. But my role at the moment is simply to introduce the members of the panel so you get to know some of the dramatis personae who have participated in the conversations leading up to the composition of the Passion. Moving from your right, my left, across the panel here, we have Micheál O'Sheill, the Irish poet, who did a wonderful reading that many of us attended last night and has been a member of the consultation. James McMillan himself, the composer. Professor Alan Torrance from St. Andrews University in Scotland, Professor of Theology. Of our own faculty, Professor Ray Barfield, who holds joint appointment in the Divinity School and the School of Medicine. His appointment is in pediatric oncology and Christian philosophy. And yes.
Still didn't make sense to me either.
Next to him, Professor David Ford from Cambridge University, and at the far end, Professor Ellen Davis, Professor of Old Testament here in the Divinity School. And to my right, who will be speaking in a moment, Professor Jeremy Begbie, who is the leader of the Duke Initiatives in Theology and the Arts. It's been a really exciting set of conversations that have led up to this moment, and we are thrilled to have all of our guests on the panel here with us. So I'm going to turn it over now to Professor Begbie to lead the conversation.
Thank you very much, Richard. May I express my delight and indeed my gratitude to all those who have made these events possible, not least our UK visitors. As Richard says, the US premiere of James McMillan's Luke Passion marks the culmination of a collaboration between Duke Divinity School and faculty from the University of Cambridge and elsewhere, which began in 2010, when a group of us met in Cambridge to explore together how the arts might enrich the work of theology. By the way, panel, you're just going to have to either crick neck or just gently slide to the side. Bit of subtle maneuver there. A group of us met in Cambridge to explore, as I say, how the arts might enrich the work of theology in both church and the academy. We concentrated our attention on the Passion of Christ, not least because we were meeting in the context of a music festival at King's College, Cambridge, which runs every year right through Holy Week, Easter at King's. We met, we talked, we argued, and took part in the events of that week. Some members of the Duke community took part in a performance of James McMillan's giant St. John Passion in King's College Chapel, which was performed on Good Friday. And these are some photos from the rehearsal. This is James. That was the quickest way he found of communicating his intentions to the choir. After the performance of the John Passion, it was the former dean of the school, Greg Jones, who first suggested that Duke Divinity School co-commission a St. Luke Passion, and that a Duke Cambridge team work with James to that end, and that the piece be performed eventually in Duke Chapel. And we had the pleasure of meeting with James during that week. So that was the idea, and needless to say, the incoming dean, Richard Hayes, instantly agreed. And James said yes on the spot. I'd love to put a caption to that, wouldn't you? Yes. Prizes, we'll have prizes afterwards for the best. James also said yes on the spot, and there followed a series of meetings here and in Cambridge, the group now including poet Micheál O'Sheill and Ray Barfield. Now, obviously, you can't compose a piece like this by committee. The composer is very definitely James himself, and all sorts of influences go into writing a piece like this. But what we hoped is that the kind of rich discussion possible with a group like this, with its own theological and artistic resources and expertise, might enrich James's work, and in the process we would be challenged to think about how the arts can enrich theology. And I'm sure the panel would agree this has been very much a two-way process. I had the privilege of establishing a similar group with James a few years back. I knew we were all in for a great treat. So these are some slides from our meetings. That's a familiar seminar room in Duke. Professor Ford didn't always agree with everything that we said. But he's really a very cheerful kind of person, so don't worry. So eventually, and that's with Sarah Coakley, who can't be here this lunchtime Saturday, but she'll be joining us later. Eventually, ahead of time, the work was complete. It had its world premiere about 3 weeks ago in the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam. But a far superior performance will be given this Sunday in Duke, thank you, yeah, good, in Duke Chapel, conducted by Rodney Wynkoop. Now, although the piece itself is the most visible outcome of the collaboration, there were numerous other benefits and lessons learned which we're still processing, and I hope will generate all sorts of similar projects in the future. So now I'm going to call on three representatives of the panel. I've asked each to highlight just one thing, or possibly two or three, that they have learned and valued, from the process. So first, Ellen. And Ellen, in advance, sends her apologies. She has to slip away to something else after this, so that's why she's slipping away. Then I'm going to call on David. Well, if David could just follow, David Ford after that, then Ray Barfield. And then I'm going to ask the composer, James, to respond to these contributions and say something himself about what he's learned from this process and enjoyed. Ellen, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Begbie, and thank you all, and especially James McMillan, for the great joy of this 4 years. I think the question you asked me, Jeremy, was what was it like to work with James McMillan? And I've observed two, possibly three things, all of them that have to do with Christian character in the first instance, and with his work as a composer of sacred music in the second instance. And those two or three things are humility and patience. I think they may be the same in this case, and simplicity. So first, humility, specifically with respect to the biblical text. We began our work, remarkably enough, with theological exegesis. And that is most of what we did as a group for a long time. James McMillan was interested in learning about the whole shape of the Gospel according to Luke, even the whole shape of Luke Acts, and not just the particular part he was going to use in his composition. This interest in the shape of the whole is evident in the final composition, which begins, as you'll hear, with Mary's question, "How can this be?" and ends with the Ascension in Acts. That kind of humility, that patient interest in the whole text, is not common among Christian composers in my experience, not even amongst those trained at Duke, nor is it common among interpreters of the biblical text in other modes, including preachers. It is a model, I think, of how we should be positioned standing under the biblical text, rather than approaching it like a raiding party, looking for the goods that we can snatch quickly and right away. Another character trait I have observed is simplicity. I certainly do not remember everything we have discussed over these several years, but one thing has stuck with me. We talked about it again this morning, and that's James Macmillan's stated intention to write each successive Passion composition, because he has written 2 now and intends to write Mark and Matthew, to write each successive Passion composition for a broader audience, a more inclusive group of musicians, including, I believe, his own Glasgow parish church, which I take it is not populated primarily by highly trained musicians. This too strikes me as an expression of humility. I think of T.S. Eliot saying that one should write for as broad an audience as one can do with intellectual integrity. It seems to me that with respect to sacred music, it is also an evangelical intention to enable people to lay firmer hold upon the difficult hope of the gospel. In short, what I have observed in working with James Macmillan over 4 years is someone working out his vocation as a Christian musician, a member of the church, a member of a neighborhood parish. That he is also working on a world stage is secondary and perhaps even incidental to that. Thank you, and thank you, James.
Well, Ellen and I discovered that we had decided to concentrate on a few of the same themes last night. I mean, first of all, I found it very moving, that rooting in the parish of St. Columba's in Glasgow, where Jimmy actually does, leads the choir and composes things that the choir can actually sing. And that quality of being attentive to who the performers are as well as who the audience is. Was also there in his way of taking part in our sessions. I mean, I think of Paul Griffiths' work on religious reading. We were doing religious reading together, that really savouring the text and so forth. And Jimmy gave a model of how to listen. There's a lovely phrase in one of Miho's poems about listening as never before, and that sense that as a group we were doing that sort of listening, and he helped us to do that. Now, I had wanted to also to talk about simplicity, as Ellen has, and that move in the 4 Gospels, that he has his vision of moving from a rather complex, very hard to perform St. John Passion that we've already done, so to speak, into the St. Luke Passion that we're about to hear, then into Mark, and then into Matthew, with increasing simplicity and that, which is a lovely vision. But I also want to note the range of things, that in the conversation we ranged all over. The conversation went here, it went there, it went there. In other words, it was all over. I think of that marvellous phrase of George Herbert in a poem I have just managed to learn off by heart, his poem on prayer, about the Christian plummet sounding heaven and earth. This sense that we were sounding heaven, we were sounding earth. It was a plummet that could go up as well as down, so to speak. And this sense that it's God in relation to all things, and then somehow in the great work of art you focus down and you come down to that distillation of meaning that's dense, that's intense, but it's got its background of resonating all over the universe. And that's why also I think I really like the fact that the eventual St. Luke Passion culminates with the Ascension. This plummet sounds heaven as well as earth, and yet keeps them all together as well. So thank you very much indeed, James, and everyone in the group. It's been absolutely glorious.
Thank you, David.
I want to know who decided that I was going to go after them. The Holy Spirit.
The Holy Spirit.
Okay. Well, I was actually sitting in class with Jeremy, talking about the role of the Ons Martineau, an instrument in Messiaen. And an idea came to me for a poem that I wanted to write, that now it's called Dante's New Moon. And at this point, it's around 200 pages long. When I went to Cambridge to listen to, well, to participate into the group, but also at one point to be listening to some of James' remarks, I realized I had forgotten paper. And so I just jotted notes up the side of the manuscript of the poem that I was working on at the time. And that's what I drew from when I decided to answer Jeremy's question, which is, what was it like to be in this process? And what I came away with was a question that was very intriguing to me, which is, how do you faithfully write a Luke's Passion so that it can also be meaningfully heard by even a secular audience? And the first audience that heard it at the world premiere was primarily a secular audience that ended with a standing ovation. And the conclusion that I came to after looking at some of the notes that I wrote down from James is that the only way to do it is to not be afraid and to trust in three things. Now, I'm only allowed to make one point, so I'm going to say trust in three parts of one thing. Number one, A, B, and C. So A, trust in silence. James has said that when he composes, it's in silence that he first hears the music. And silence always precedes and follows our hearing of a piece of music, just as it will on Sunday when you listen to the piece. But the silences at the start and at the end of the piece of music are different. Part of the reason that they are uniquely different, in this case, is B. You have to trust that a composer involved umbilically with liturgy, which is how he described himself, can allow musicians to become the midwives of prayer. And that's also a phrase from him. And I thought it was a very beautiful point about how to compose. C, you have to trust that music in some way can make the kingdom of God palpable. Now, in English, I'm interested, since I don't speak any of the 14 languages represented to my left, the word passion stands in for what fired the heart of Dante when he saw Beatrice in front of the chapel in Florence. And it also stands in for the suffering of our Lord. Now, this is a Xerox of one of the 200 pages from Dante's New Moon. And I was looking where I wrote down some of the notes about James's talk, his comments. And I also had jotted down Canto 28 from the Paradiso. Look at the closest ring. I would have you know that it spins so fast by virtue of love's fire, the ray of which pierces it through and through. These two senses of the word passion that can relate to both love and to piercing are something that James has brought home. Love and the pain of being pierced. Both of these are deeply human, widely human. No matter who shows up for this piece of music, knowing what it is to be pierced and to love is going to be understood. Both of these can also be frightening, perhaps especially to someone left alone. And in the middle of either kind of passion, for one who's been rendered mute and silent in any way, the music, as you will hear on Sunday, can offer a chance to hear over and over the words, "Do not be afraid." Thank you.
I think we should give a special Duke welcome to the composer himself. Do you know?
Thank you very much, everybody. It's a great delight to be here once again at Duke. I had a lovely time, a learning time when I was last here. And it's about that learning I think I should speak to at the moment, because it's a very unusual experience for a composer to write like this. This doesn't normally happen. Composers don't have a panel of discussion partners to engage with in in-depth conversation before even a note is written. When I tell some of my fellow composers about what I've been doing, they look at me incredulously. They can't imagine how it might work. Perhaps it shouldn't, but I think it has. But it was unusual. Usually what a composer does, and it's been alluded to already, that he goes, or he or she goes into a place of silence and does everything. Does all the research, the necessary research, before writing the music. And if the work requires a degree of extra musical research, as I think this piece did, that has to be thorough. What's happened here is that the research has been provided on a platter, a golden platter, for me by these extraordinarily generous individuals. Jeremy has put together a group of experts, and every word they spoke to me had an impact on the way I thought about the music and how I structured the music. And I think it's clear right from the beginning of the piece that the impact has been a substantial one and an effective one. The work does not begin at the usual place, the usual part of the narrative, at the beginning of chapter 22. It begins right at the beginning of St. Luke's Gospel. And I remember a lot of the discussion, both here and in Cambridge, about the entire Gospel, the beginning of St. Luke, the end of St. Luke, and then on into the Acts of the Apostles. This is the first time as a non-theologian that I had sat and absorbed such a wide-ranging and deep context. I'd never done it before in any piece I had written. And the discussion about the early part and the later part of the Gospel provided an important prelude and postlude for me. The prelude of the work begins right at the Annunciation with the words of the angel. There are other quotations from early in the St. Luke Gospel, particularly from the Magnificat and from the Benedictus, and from excerpts from other parts early in the life of Jesus, that provided an ongoing context, both at the beginning and then at the end. And at the end, in the postlude, the music and the words go beyond the resurrection, beyond the death and resurrection of Christ, to the ascension. I suppose when any composer is telling the story of Christ's crucifixion and death, the words are very complete. The words are quite bald in a way. They tell the story in quick-fire language that is shocking, dramatic, compelling. By looking at the beginning and the end of the St. Luke Gospel, I was able to step outside the narrative and, I suppose, think in terms of a kind of stream of consciousness. We were talking about this morning, that I was able to absorb a number of the threads, the textual and theological threads that are provided there at the beginning and end of the Gospel, in order for the music to tease out a deeper meaning. And I suppose that's what music does. Music has the ability to go in between the words, to provide a resonator for a deeper meaning. Music, of course, has this ability to enter into a collaboration with the other arts, in particular literature and text and visuals. But beyond that, at a fundamental level, music is the most abstract of the arts. Music communicates its meaning, its beauty, in terms that have nothing to do with words or indeed visuals. I think this is what I was attempting to do in the first and final parts of this piece of music. That in a sense music can go beyond the text itself, deeper into the crevices of the soul, and perhaps in those places finds a deeper meaning to the text. As I say, it was a unique way of working. I don't know if I'll ever do this again. I don't know if it could be done again, but I would heartily recommend it to my fellow composers to try just once, to see if it works for them. And my hope is that the experience of having these ongoing conversations with some extraordinarily generous and expert people will impact in the way that I think about how to prepare for future work, whether it be the Mark Passion and the Matthew. But even in abstract works, there might be something in this collaboration, this ongoing process of discussion, that might have an impact even on my most abstract thoughts. That the music itself may be shaped and influenced and touched by the experience of having shared a profound theological and spiritual journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jimmy. We've agreed that rather than having each member of the panel speak, that we would select a few of us to speak, and that's what we've done because we want to leave time for questions and conversation with those of you in the audience. And it may be that in the back and forth, Michal O'Shiel and Alan Torrance, who haven't yet had an opportunity to speak, will also want to jump in and say some further things in response to your questions. But before we go to open it up to the audience, I want to mention that there's one other member of our collaborative consultation who is not able to be here with us today. That's Dr. Kevin Rowe, who played a crucial role in this collaboration because of the fact that his scholarly work has focused particularly on the Gospel of Luke, and so he actually did the initial framing introduction to the narrative of the Gospel at the beginning of our collaborative process. He's not able to be with us here today because of illness in his family and his responsibility to be at home. So he's written me an email that I got just a couple of hours ago apologizing that he's not able to be here and expressing his frustration and disappointment about that. But I wanted to read it to you. It's a short email, but it also gives you a bit of the flavor, I think, of some of the conversations we had. So after I read this, then we'll open it for your comments and questions. He writes, "It's very frustrating to me not to be there because one of the things I wanted to praise the work for was the use of Luke alone. In contrast to some of the other things that have gone under the heading of one of the evangelists, St. John's Passion, this is actually St. Luke's Passion. The texts allow the distinctiveness of the scriptural witness to come forth." He's referring here in part to Macmillan's own St. John Passion, which interweaves texts from Catholic liturgy into the text of the John Passion. But you might also think, for example, of Bach's St. Matthew Passion, which intersperses devotional choral parts into the work. Continuing Cavan's message, "I don't know if Jimmy remembers that I raised this issue at our very first meeting with him here in Durham, but when I gave the little opening presentation to get us situated vis-a-vis Luke's Gospel, I spoke about the difference between a piece of music that would be a St. Luke's Passion and a piece that would be," and now you have to imagine he's writing this next phrase with each word in the phrase capitalized. "The difference between a piece of music that would be St. Luke's Passion and a piece that would be a Passion with some material from St. Luke and elsewhere too, period. I said that these latter kind are doubtless important and perform something of the synthesizing task that any reader of the fourfold gospel needs to perform, but then we should just call the work The Passion of Christ. If we want to name the work after one of the evangelist's portrayals, then we need to do justice to the specifics that make it a St. Luke's Passion in particular. Well done to one and all. My heartfelt regrets for not being there today. Yours, Kevin. So that both gives you some of the flavor of the conversation within the group, as well as some of Kevin Rowe's austere Reformed sensibilities, which posed a very interesting counterpoint to Jimmy's Catholic sensibilities. So we want to open it up now for your comments and questions. Yes, Nate.
The role of Christ in the John Passion is sung by a solo baritone, which seems traditional if we look at Bach's work and stuff. And then now here is sung by a children's choir that is broken up into multiple parts. At first that seemed strange to me to break Christ up, but it also seemed to open up the possibility of dissonance. I was wondering, and dissonance is not evil, but it can convey pain and suffering, which seems appropriate to the Passion. So I was wondering if that was part of the conversation between the biblical scholars and musicians.
Could everyone hear the first part of the question about why the part of Christ is sung by a children's chorus?
I suppose what I was keen to do in every aspect in the St. Luke Passion was to write it differently from the St. John. And that touches on Cavan's point about intertextuality. My St. John Passion was full of other texts, as he points out. But so is Bach's. So there's nothing too Catholic about that. I think first of all, with St. John, it does use, as you say, an adult baritone as Christ, and that's a traditional way of doing it, I suppose. And the role of Christ therefore becomes very immediate and human. But there are other ways. There's other ways of telling the story, and that's the fundamental aspiration for me. And therefore there are other ways of presenting Christ, other aspects of his divinity, his uniqueness. And there's something about young voices, I think, that points to an ethereal, perhaps even otherworldliness, certainly possibly a divinity that is not immediate in the purely grounded humanity of an adult male voice. There's something about a young voice which of course evokes purity and innocence, which are concepts and qualities that we also associate with Christ. But by making it a corporeal or a corporate choral entity, you're able to present the words of Christ in very different ways. You can have all of the choir singing exactly the same line, so there's a unity there. You can divide the choir into 2 or 3, and 3 of course is a very important number, not just in music but in theology. And there's a Trinitarian suggestion in the use of 3, and always has been through the literature the literature of sacred music through the ages. And composers have been fascinated by number. 3, 7, 12, of course. There's the 12 chromatic pitches and so on. We're, as I say, we're obsessed with number and its potential meaning. The fact that these numbers may be symbols or ciphers to a deeper meaning. And 3, I think, with its Trinitarian dimension, was certainly in my mind when I was able to divide the choir into 3. But of course you can divide the choirs into 3 in different ways. You can make it homophonic or you can make it polyphonic. So there's a whole range of diverse possibilities in setting the words of Christ, or indeed any other character in the story, by using a choir rather than an individual.
I wonder, David, if you would want to amplify that with some of the remarks you made in our conversation this morning on this point.
Yeah, two of the things that I was saying this morning was that because Luke is the only gospel with the child Jesus in it, I felt that taking the child, the children's voices right through as the voice of Christ made it resonate with the whole gospel in a much more in a much fuller way, and also more. I mean, what I was talking about was I'm fascinated by Jean Vanier and the L'Arche communities and the way in which they emphasize, having people with disabilities at the center, and the way in which Jesus says, he puts the child at the center. And to have the sense of that going right through this passion is that the Christ at the center of our world is the Christ who is the child, the Christ who is there in the child, who is there in the disabled, there in the marginalized, there in the poor. And that therefore the theology of the whole thing is really deeply transformed by it, and also so many of those with disabilities. I mean, I've just come out of Angola, in Louisiana State Penitentiary, for a week, for only a week, and that sense that so many of those in that position are corporate, and therefore to have a corporate choir as the voice of Christ, I find extraordinarily powerful.
Good, thank you. Let's hear other questions. Mark Foreman over here.
So I guess my question is it's musical but also theological, a broader question about why a passion. Particularly, I'm curious because, as James, I'm sure you know, and maybe others have discussed, there have been something of a boom of passions in the last 15 years, Tandun and some others who have written around the year 2000 in addition to your own. So, and there are many other oratorio genres that Christians have used over the last few centuries. So what was it about the passion in particular that focused the theological and musical work of the committee? And I'll leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're right, first of all, to say there's been a kind of explosion of settings of the Passion in recent years. And that in itself is interesting after quite a long silence. And the silence, of course, has something to do with the fact that there's no liturgical necessity for it anymore. The Passions from the past that we know and love were written specifically for liturgy, whether Lutheran or Catholic. And that relationship of employer-employee between composer and church is no longer there. So there's not the same degree of necessity to write. Also, there has been a breach in the world of belief, I suppose, between many artists in the last couple of 100 years and the church and what the church teaches. The curious thing, though, with music, that breach has been incomplete, and if you look at the 20th century, some of the major composers of the 20th century were indeed profoundly religious men and women. Stravinsky, Schoenberg with his reconversion to Judaism, John Cage went to study with Schoenberg and he explored his own spiritual journey through the religions and philosophies of the Far East. Messiaen, famously Catholic, and so on. So when composers of our own age come to the Passion story, they're doing it in a kind of with a post-Enlightenment mindset, and some of the people who write these Passions are not necessarily believers, which is in itself fascinating. The fact that the story still has its power to provoke and to inspire men and women of modernity says it all, in a way, and I personally have always been fascinated by it and have circled round these 3 days in history, the most important days in history, in a number of different ways before now, whether it be the 7 last words of the cross, another work called Visitatio Sepulchri, the Visitation to the Sepulchre, a little piano trio called 14 Little Pictures, based on the 14 Stations of the Cross, Triduum, which is a collection of 3 orchestral works, so purely abstract works, which allowed me in pure music and nothing but music to explore the ideas. It became apparent that I was leading myself up to setting the Passion properly, as it were. And after setting the St. John, I got hooked, and I wanted to revisit the form, if form is the word, in different ways. Having mentioned the Mark and the Matthew, I want there to be a long time before I get back to the Mark and the Matthew. Maybe I don't want to keep repeating myself, but maybe 10 years from now I might be able to return.
Thank you. Yes, there's David in the back here.
James, I wanted to follow up on a question I asked you last night about your choice of the use of English as a language. And I asked this as a lay musical person with little familiarity of how choral works are composed and presented and experienced. But it seems to me that if a work of choral music, or like a Passion, is in Latin, it is unintelligible to a large swath of audiences around the world, and yet perhaps curiously or ironically accessible, because it can be experienced as, the words can be experienced as sound, and not so much as a communication of specific ideas or text. Whereas when you go into English, which I thought was wonderful, it becomes a very particular kind of communication to particular audiences. Now, to a Christian audience, I would imagine this experience of the Passion might be more meaningful or deep, or in a sense, liturgically, spiritually, theologically rich. Whereas, curiously, ironically, putting it in English could be off-putting to folks who are secular or of other religious persuasions, because now they're being confronted with the very concrete, sharp-edged nature of this biblical text in a liturgical tradition, which is evoking, for some in the audience, an actual response, an actual, if you will, liturgical or spiritual, some sort of response, whereas if it were in Latin, the audience could stay at some kind of remove from the musical choral experience and just say, aesthetically, this was inspiring or transcendent or whatever. But the moment it comes into English, it has this capacity to invite as well as to repel. And so I didn't know if you had any thoughts, or if others had thoughts on that.
Yes. Well, first of all, there's nothing wrong with inspiring or transcendent. And that's one of the reasons that Latin is still the official language of the Church. It's a heightened way of prayer, and I'm glad it's still available to modern man for their prayers, or indeed for settings. But what you say is very interesting, because people who love music, and most of them probably nowadays are not believers, or maybe not conventional believers. I mean, that audience in Amsterdam, for example, I was just looking at some of the video coverage this morning. It was on the television over there, and it's probably the most secular audience in the world in Amsterdam. But there they were, listening to a Passion setting in the modern lingua franca. They speak better English than we do in Holland, but they had the text and subtitles above in Dutch. But so all what you say resonates. I suppose those who love their music, especially the Bach Passions, are used to hearing it in 18th century German, and those others who love their Victoria or Palestrina hear the Passion settings in Latin. So that when they hear the words spoken in a reasonably modern but still poetic English, they're struck by the immediacy of the narrative. And I've spoken to many who have heard both my St. John and St. Luke, who most of whom are not church goers or believers, were struck by the immediacy of the story. Some say that it's as if they're hearing the story for the first time. And that can be a good thing, or indeed it can be a troubling thing, especially in a world nowadays where many secular people suspect believers of trying to, suspect them of a lot, including trying to convert them. And so sometimes secular audiences, modern secular audiences, are on edge about the Christian artist in the world, and I've certainly experienced that, and it takes a lot of patient dialogue to explain exactly what one's motivations are. The positive thing, though, is that my experience of the audience, those who love music, recognize the deep heritage that we have in the Judeo-Christian philosophies, and respect that. And they also, whether they're believers or not, still regard music as probably the most spiritual of the arts. And they may mean different things by that, but and they may mean different things from what a Christian means when he says music is a spiritual art form. However, I still think they have an experience of music which points to something more than the sum of their parts. That music, in a sense, looks to the beyond and can open vistas on what I might call the divine, and that's why they love music so much.
I'm going to ask Micheál O'Shiel if he would like to add anything here at this point, because he is, of our colloquy members, the most expert about the nuances and use of language. It's no accident that his most recent published smaller volume of poetry was called Tongues. And so, Micheál, I wonder if you would like to comment on this.
I suppose really the first thing that strikes me about it is that when you think about the text at all, whether you're talking about them in Latin or whatever, you've got to remember that these texts were written in other languages. So the traditions that we know often are translations. And there are many variants of the translations, and people with strong feelings about them. My own take on it is really that you don't, in some ways, know the text at all unless you know the original. But then there is a tradition within each culture develops in the language, in the given language. That also, as it changes, because people have to always keep adapting to make it current, if it's going to be current, and there's always people complaining about saying, for instance, will you hide your light under a bushel or do you put it under a barrel? And people fall in love with, of course, bushel because of the sound of the word, even though it's gone out of our usual parlance. But my own take on that is it's best to have a choice, so people can take whichever text that they, in their given tradition, that they want. But may I just make another point, leaving the language business aside for a minute, just to bring it back to what the focus of this session was, that is, how this process of conversation worked for an artist. And I'm fascinated by this because I know I share with Jimmy, as a poet, he as a musician, the view that we are not simply individualistic. We're not part of the romantic movement that sees us, I think, ourselves as being the suffering alone individual artist, but rather part of a community. And what was fascinating for me observing this process was that this is actually an enactment of community. It doesn't mean that you don't make the individual choices as an artist, as you had to, obviously, in the end, Jimmy, but we are still part of, it's a performance of community in the process, in the creative process, and that has fascinated me, so I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to, Divinity students in the audience, take note that of Micheál's statement that you don't know the text at all unless you know it. Another question in the far back.
I just wanted to ask about the piece starting with the Annunciation and then ending with the Ascension and how both of those events correspond with the agency of women in the piece, how that informed the panel theologically and then the piece musically.
The strange thing was I hadn't thought about it until you mentioned it there, which is a strange admission to make. But I was someone in Holland after the performance spoke to me about. It's slightly changing the point about it, but the children's choir were all girls, teenage girls mainly, and I was asked if that was me making like a feminist statement, and I just said yes because I wanted the brownie points. So I'll remember this and talk it up in future discussions I have. But it's a very interesting point you make, and I'm delighted to hear it.
Okay, Steve Harper.
There are some absolutely fantastic dramatic points made in the music, in the composition, both in silence and in loudness, in texture and homophonic sounds. But throughout the piece, you've used some interesting techniques, and maybe you could make a comment or two about some of the scales which are extremely difficult to learn and to master and to repeat, and why you bring in that kind of a challenge for us as performers and singers.
Scales? What do you mean by scales? The modes?
Well, the octatonic scale, for
Yeah.
example, isn't something we use every day, and
Yeah.
It took a lot of work.
Yeah.
Still, and then it's not repeated necessarily consistently in another sense. It's just very interesting, and I'm wondering why make some comment about your use of the tool set.
Yeah. Well, it's become my language. There's some things like the octatonic scale drifts into the kind of musical language that I use a lot. I suppose I think about it melodically rather than in a vertical sense, and I've always been struck by monodic forms, especially from that part of the world where Christ lived, and we hear a lot of that textured modality in Arabic song and of course Jewish melodies, where different modes are used, and I've always been struck by the beauty of that, the sense of otherness, but also the centrality of it towards the whole crucifixion narrative. That a modality and a form of singing that Christ might have known, a highly ornamented line, for example, could still be embraced by a modern composer, by a living composer, and to be made part of a living, indeed, a living language of modernity. As far as the difficulties are concerned, I'm delighted that you've worked hard at it. That sounds great. I knew choirs would have to work at it, but I'm delighted that already choirs who would describe themselves as committed amateurs have the commitment and desire to take on something unusual like this, and take on something challenging. Yeah.
Do you mean the Amsterdam choir was professional?
It was, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So this is the first amateur choir performance?
It is, and the next one will be amateur, the English performance with the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra Chorus. I suppose over the years, I love working with amateurs, whether it be in the local church that has already been mentioned, or young performers, volunteer choirs, community choirs, and it's important to mirror what Michael said about feeling a part of your community. You want to be involved, you want to be useful to your fellow musicians as well, regardless of their experiences. And if a composer can write something, even though it may challenge some, for a community choir, for a non-professional choir, for me that is a huge motivation. And knowing that, for example, the British choral context and culture, there are marvellous choirs there who do aim for the top all the time, and all the great symphonic choruses in the UK, you know, the chorus that sings with the London Symphony Orchestra, or with the Philharmonia, are amateur choruses, but yet they're asked to do some of the most high-level work. And I think that's a great thing when amateurs and professionals can work together like that.
We're nearly out of time. I want to ask Professor Alan Torrance if he would like to add something to what's been said so far.
Yes, just a brief point. At the beginning of this session, Jimmy's made the comment that music enters the crevices of our soul. And I was immediately reminded of a discussion that Jeremy and I had back in the year 2000, walking in a path outside of Cambridge. And Jeremy made the comment about that he thought there was a parallel between a great piece of music and the incarnation. Because what happens with a great piece of music? A great piece of music enters into our soul and articulates all the turbulent goings on there. Very often the fear, the loneliness, sense of injustice, and expresses these to us, makes something beautiful out of them, heals them, and then presents us with a kind of a healed, reordered existence. Now, what's the incarnation about? That the eternal Son of God comes, assumes our fallen, alienated, confused humanity, identifying with our loneliness, our fears, injustice, and so on, and heals it in his person, and presents to us our humanity, healed and restored and transformed. That's the gospel. Now, in this passion, what's magnificent to me is that Jimmy seems to be bringing those two dimensions together. We have this remarkable piece of music articulating moments of violence and turbulence and fear and loneliness and so on, dissonance and discord, and then moments of calm and healing, transforming peace. And what's he doing through all that? He's presenting us with the incarnation. So the music is articulating and presenting us with reconciliation by holding forth the Son who's identified with us. And so at the start of the piece, it begins. And just before the intercession. So before the intermission, that was Freudian. And just before the intermission, at the end of the whole first section, we have the words, "Do not be afraid." The music and what the music's holding forth is saying that to us. And then right at the end, before the postlude, "Why are you troubled? And why do questionings rise in your heart?" And the answer is the ascension. Okay? So it's been an enormous privilege to be involved in this project. And what's just particularly moving to me is the way those two elements come together.
Well, thank you, Professor Torrance. And in view of our time, I think that will have to be our last comment. It's an extremely fitting summing up of both the nature of our process and the product that has come out of it in James Macmillan's St. Luke Passion. All of us are very much looking forward to hearing it performed. I've seen, by the way, a number of other hands going up. I regret that we are out of time, but that simply recapitulates what I think all of us experienced throughout this process, that we would come to the end of our discussions feeling, wait, there are many more things we want to talk about. And we have the pleasure of continuing some of that conversation later this afternoon as we hear James talk about the work of composition and get to hear yet another response to it from Professor Sarah Coakley. That'll be at 5 o'clock in Goodson Chapel. I want to say a word of thanks to all of our panelists, not only for your participation here today, but for the rich contributions you've made to the conversations that have fed into this composition of the St. Luke Passion. So let's thank them all.